Liam Harper never thought the barn at the far edge of his property would one day become the center of a battle with the very people who claimed to be his neighbors. To him, the structure was not an eyesore, not a hazard, not some decaying piece of wood that dragged down property values, but a living fragment of his past, built by his father's hands long before the subdivision sprouted around it with its manicured lawns and identical facades. The barn was more than lumber and nails. It was the place where he had spent countless hours as a boy, sitting in the rafters while his father worked below, listening to the hum of tools and the scrape of wood. Later, after his father passed away and life became a series of responsibilities he hadn't asked for, the barn transformed into something else. A quiet sanctuary where he retreated with his sketchbooks and blueprints, the only space where the noise of the world did not press in on him. As an architect, Liam lived surrounded by lines, angles, and perfect measurements, but the barn reminded him of imperfection, of things built slowly, carefully, with character that could not be mass-produced or regulated into existence. After his wife died, the barn became even more than that. She had loved the old structure, had once planted wildflowers along its side that bloomed each spring despite the neglect. Liam sometimes sat on the weathered steps and tried to remember the sound of her voice as she teased him for always saving things. Old hinges, bent nails, planks too warped to be useful but too meaningful to discard. She used to say that the barn was his mirror, a little worn but still standing with stubborn dignity. For Liam, preserving it was not just about nostalgia. It was about holding on to the only tangible proof that life before grief had been real. He had no children, no close family nearby, and the house often felt like a shell, but the barn gave him purpose, maintaining it, repairing its beams, sanding its doors. It was a ritual that connected him to something larger than the sterile rhythm of suburban life. The neighbors did not see it that way. To them, the barn was simply a relic that clashed with the pristine homogeneity of their streets. The homeowners association had been circling it for years, sending passive-aggressive notes about aesthetic inconsistencies and community safety concerns. Liam had ignored them, convinced that sooner or later they would grow tired of targeting him and turn their attention to someone else who left a garbage bin out a day too long or painted their shutters the wrong shade of beige. He paid his dues on time, kept his front yard neat, and asked for nothing from anyone. He assumed that by living quietly, by minding his own business, he would be left alone. But the barn was too visible, too different, and difference was something the HOA never tolerated for long. He often wondered if the hostility was truly about safety, or if the barn simply reminded the board members of something they could not control. While most houses in the neighborhood were products of uniform construction, stamped out of blueprints designed to satisfy codes rather than souls, his barn was unruly, a structure that predated their bylaws and did not fit into their brochures. It resisted them by existing, and that resistance seemed to provoke them more each year. Liam knew that people like Julian Cross, the current president of the HOA, thrived on asserting authority. Julian was a man who dressed in polished shoes for a mailbox check, who smiled with his mouth while his eyes weighed you like a nuisance, who spoke about the community as though it were his personal kingdom. To him, Liam's barn was not a sentimental monument, but an opportunity to demonstrate the reach of his control. Liam felt it each time Julian passed his property during evening walks, his gaze lingering not on the house but on the barn, as if calculating how long it would take before pressure turned into compliance. Despite all this, Liam kept working on the barn quietly. He repaired the roof after a storm, replaced some beams, treated the wood to resist rot. He was not reckless. He knew about building codes, knew about fire safety, and he had the expertise to ensure the structure was sound. He even installed a basic sprinkler system inside, an ironic move considering the HOA had never bothered to install one in their own clubhouse. Yet no amount of effort could change the perception that the barn did not belong. It stood as a reminder of the land's history before the lawns and playgrounds, before the subdivision was carved out of fields. Every time Liam swept its floor or wiped dust from the old windows, he felt the same quiet defiance. As long as he lived here, the barn would remain. But he underestimated how far the HOA would go. What he saw as a personal space tied to memory, they saw as a challenge, and challenges demanded punishment. For years he had endured their warnings with weary indifference, telling himself that the worst they could do was send letters. He was wrong. What began as whispers about safety hazards was about to crystallize into something more severe, and for the first time since his wife's death, Liam would be forced to step out of his solitude and fight. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday afternoon, folded into a thick envelope stamped with the insignia of the Homeowners Association, a crest that to Liam Harper always looked less like a symbol of community and more like the wax seal of some medieval guild. He nearly threw it onto the pile of circulars and bills on his kitchen counter without opening it, assuming it was just another notice about lawn height regulations or reminder about the upcoming neighborhood barbecue he never attended. But something about the weight of the envelope made him pause. When he finally slid it open with the edge of a kitchen knife and unfolded the stapled pages, his stomach sank. The words were written in stiff, officious language, declaring that after an inspection conducted the previous week, his barn had been deemed a significant fire hazard that posed a threat to surrounding properties. The document listed a series of supposed violations: exposed timber susceptible to ignition, lack of adequate fire suppression, insufficient electrical compliance. It demanded that he either demolish the structure or complete a full restorative update within 30 days, at his own expense, subject to HOA oversight. Failure to comply, the letter warned, would result in escalating fines, liens, and potential legal action. Liam read the pages twice, then a third time, unable to believe what he was seeing. His barn was not a fire hazard. He had designed and overseen entire commercial projects in the city with stricter fire codes than anything the HOA could dream up, and he had applied the same diligence to maintaining the barn. The wiring had been replaced only 3 years earlier, the interior was fitted with extinguishers and sprinklers, and the roof was shingled with treated material that resisted flames. The accusations were not just exaggerated, they were fabricated. He felt a wave of indignation rise in him, but beneath it there was something else, something colder. The recognition that this was not simply about safety. This was a maneuver, a deliberate strike designed to force his hand. He could practically hear Julian Cross dictating the phrasing, his voice dripping with faux concern about the well-being of all residents, masking the hunger to finally erase the one structure in the neighborhood that refused to conform. By evening, the absurdity of the situation had begun to settle into a leaden anger. Liam walked out to the barn, letter in hand, and stood before its weathered boards as if expecting them to somehow answer the accusation. The late sun slanted across the yard, casting long shadows over the grass, and he imagined his father's hands hammering nails into the beams, his wife laughing as she planted flowers along the side wall. He thought of the hours he had spent sanding, painting, repairing, all to keep the place alive, and now some committee of neighbors, people who couldn't tell a joist from a beam, had dared to label it dangerous. He unfolded the letter again and read the fine print. Should he refuse to comply, the board reserved the right to seek enforcement through municipal channels. He knew what that meant. They could take him to court, bury him under fines, even place a lien against his home. HOA power was rarely checked, and they relied on the exhaustion of residents to win. The next day, he decided to confront them directly. He walked into the HOA office, a low stucco building rented in the corner of a strip mall, its blandness belying the control it wielded over dozens of homes. The receptionist, a young woman whose expression was carefully neutral, asked if he had an appointment. He did not. She tapped a few keys and then disappeared into the back, returning moments later with Julian Cross himself, dressed in a charcoal suit as if he were running a Fortune 500 company instead of a neighborhood board. Julian's smile was precise, calculated, the kind that suggested patience with someone he had already dismissed. He ushered Liam into a small conference room where laminated posters about community pride hung slightly crooked on the walls. Julian listened while Liam explained that the accusations in the letter were baseless, that his barn was structurally sound and up to code, that he had documentation to prove it. Julian nodded occasionally, his pen scratching meaningless lines on a yellow legal pad, and when Liam finished, he folded his hands and spoke in the slow, patronizing cadence of a man who enjoyed hearing his own authority. "Liam," he said, "I understand this is difficult for you, but the inspection was thorough and unbiased. The barn presents a danger, and our responsibility is to the safety of all residents. I urge you to think of your neighbors, of the children who play nearby. No one wants to see a tragedy occur." The words were a performance, and Liam knew it. He leaned forward, his voice tight. "There is no danger. I've taken more precautions than this community has in its own facilities. Your clubhouse doesn't even have a functioning alarm system, and you dare lecture me about safety?" For the first time, Julian's composure wavered, a flicker of irritation crossing his face before he smoothed it back into a smile. "This meeting is not about the clubhouse," he replied evenly. "It's about your barn. And unless you intend to challenge this through legal counsel, the board's decision stands." 30 days. That night, Liam sat at his kitchen table with the letter spread before him, the silence of the house pressing in like a weight. He considered his options. He could try to comply, spend tens of thousands of dollars on unnecessary renovations just to appease them, or he could let the barn go, demolish it himself before they forced him to. Both choices felt like defeat. The third option, the one Julian had practically invited with his condescension, was to fight. But fighting meant money, time, energy, and he was tired. He had spent years trying to rebuild some semblance of peace after his wife's death, and the thought of plunging into a legal battle with bureaucrats and neighbors made his chest tighten. Still, as he looked out the window toward the dark silhouette of the barn, he knew surrender was impossible. To give it up would be to erase a part of himself he could never recover. Over the following days, the pressure mounted. He received another letter, this one itemizing the fines that would begin accruing if he failed to demonstrate progress toward compliance. Neighbors he barely spoke to began to glance at him differently, some with pity, others with thinly veiled irritation, as though his barn's alleged danger had already been accepted as fact. At the grocery store, he overheard a woman muttering about how someone needs to think of the children before something terrible happens. The narrative was spreading, planted by the HOA and nurtured by whispers. Liam realized they were isolating him, turning public opinion against him before he could even mount a defense. That was the true danger of their strategy, not the fines or the lawsuits, but the slow corrosion of trust, the way they could transform him from a quiet neighbor into a reckless holdout in the eyes of the community. On the 10th day after receiving the first letter, Liam found something in his yard that froze him in place. Near the barn's side door lay a small pile of charred newspapers, still smelling faintly of smoke, as though someone had tried to ignite them before abandoning the attempt. The message was unmistakable. It was no longer just about paperwork and inspections. Someone wanted him frightened, compliant, ready to fold. He stood there for a long time, the late afternoon sun sinking behind the rooftops, the weight of the moment pressing on him. The barn loomed silent behind him, its walls scarred but strong, a stubborn survivor. He clenched his fists, knowing there would be no backing down. What the HOA had unleashed was not just a dispute over property, but the beginning of a war. The next community meeting was held in the HOA's Clubhouse, a building that Liam had always thought of as both laughably pretentious and quietly sinister, with its faux colonial columns and heavy double doors that seemed less an invitation than a warning. He had not attended a meeting in years, preferring to stay as far as possible from the endless arguments about hedge heights, mailboxes, and the color palettes deemed acceptable for shutters, but now he found himself walking through those doors with the HOA's notice folded tightly in his pocket like a summons. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and cheap carpet cleaner, and folding chairs had been arranged in uneven rows facing a long table where Julian Cross and several other board members sat with clipboards and water bottles, as though preparing to oversee a courtroom trial. Conversations hushed when Liam entered, not because of respect, but because his presence was already a subject of gossip. He caught fragments of whispers, barn, hazard, 30 days, before the voices fell silent. Julian opened the meeting with his usual display of civility, thanking everyone for coming and reciting a string of announcements about neighborhood watch patrols and landscaping schedules before finally clearing his throat and shifting toward the item that had drawn so many curious faces. "We must address," he said with deliberate gravity, "a matter of community safety concerning Mr. Harper's barn." His voice carried the tone of someone delivering a sermon rather than a discussion, and his eyes flicked briefly to Liam as if to remind him who held the microphone. He launched into a description of the supposed hazards, repeating the contents of the inspection report with a flair that made it sound like the barn was already smoldering and liable to collapse onto nearby homes. "This board cannot and will not allow such a danger to persist," Julian declared, "because the well-being of our families, our children, our community must always come first." Liam stood before the crowd, his jaw clenched, waiting for the moment when he would be allowed to speak, but Julian controlled the flow, pausing only to nod at murmurs of agreement from the front row. Finally, when the recital of accusations was complete, Liam was given the floor. He began, calmly, explaining that he had replaced the wiring, installed extinguishers and sprinklers, maintained the roof, and even consulted a structural engineer. He reminded them that he was an architect, trained to recognize and address safety issues, and that he had the documentation to prove his claims. For a brief moment, silence filled the room, and he thought he saw a flicker of doubt in the eyes of a few neighbors. Then a voice rose from the back, a man named Walker, whom Liam barely knew but recognized as one of Julian's quiet supporters, muttering about how experts can say anything if they're paid enough. Laughter followed, small and nervous but effective, and the weight of suspicion shifted back onto Liam. It was then that an unexpected voice cut through the tension. Mrs. Ellis, an elderly widow who lived 2 houses down, stood shakily and addressed the board in a quivering but firm tone. She reminded everyone that the clubhouse itself had never been brought up to modern fire codes, that the wiring was outdated and the alarms unreliable, and she asked why the board was so concerned about one man's barn when the building they all sat in could go up in flames far more easily. The words hung in the air like smoke. Julian's smile faltered, his pen tapping nervously against the table, but he quickly regained control, thanking her for her comment and pivoting back to the narrative of community standards. Yet the damage was done. Eyes darted around the room, and Liam could feel the first crack in Julian's facade of authority. After the meeting adjourned, Liam stepped outside into the humid night, hoping for a breath of relief. But instead he found Julian waiting near the edge of the parking lot, speaking in the low, pleasant tone of someone delivering poison wrapped in sugar. "You're making this harder than it has to be," Julian said, his smile stretched thin. "You could save yourself a lot of trouble by complying, by showing good faith. The barn isn't worth the fight." Liam met his gaze without answering, and Julian's voice dipped lower. "Things have a way of getting complicated for people who resist. Fines, liens, legal costs. You know how these things pile up." For a moment they stood in silence. 2 men locked in the quiet recognition that this was no longer about wood or wiring but about power and submission. The escalation became clear in the days that followed. Notices began arriving not just about the barn, but about supposed violations around his property. Grass an inch too long, trash bins not aligned properly at the curb, outdoor lights that allegedly exceeded brightness limits. The fines were small individually but relentless, arriving like volleys designed to wear him down. Neighbors began avoiding eye contact, as though proximity to him might invite trouble. A few whispered encouragements reached him from people who disagreed with the board but dared not speak publicly, and he realized how deeply the HOA's influence reached into the psychology of the neighborhood. Fear was their strongest tool, stronger even than their bylaws. One evening, as Liam returned home from a late drive, he noticed headlights lingering at the corner of his property, a car idling with its engine low before pulling away when he slowed his own vehicle. Another night, he discovered his mailbox door hanging loose, screws stripped as if someone had wrenched it open with unnecessary force. None of it could be proven, none of it could be tied directly to Julian or the HOA, but the timing was too exact, too coincidental. He understood the message. They were watching, waiting for him to stumble, surrounding him not with open attacks but with the suffocating presence of intimidation. Still, he could not bring himself to bend. Each time he walked into the barn and smelled the faint scent of sawdust and oil, each time he ran his hand along the rough grain of the beams his father had set into place decades earlier, his resolve hardened. The HOA wanted him to see the barn as a liability, a burden too heavy to defend, but to Liam it had become the very opposite. It was proof that he still had something worth fighting for. And if they believed they could break him with letters and threats, they had misjudged the weight of memory. Yet even as he reassured himself, he knew this was only the beginning. The barn had become more than a structure in their eyes. It was now a test, a contest of will between a solitary man and an organization drunk on authority. And in contests like these, escalation was inevitable, because people like Julian Cross could never accept defiance without seeking to crush it. Liam could already sense the shape of the storm gathering, and he understood that the first skirmish had been fought not in court but in whispers, fines, and shadows. The real battle, he suspected, was still to come, and when it arrived it would not be fought with polite notices but with fire. Liam's decision to push back against the association was not immediate, for he was not by nature a man who sought conflict, yet the steady drip of intimidation left him with little choice, and after several sleepless nights he called in a favor from a colleague in the city who connected him to an independent fire safety consultant, a man with no ties to the subdivision and no reason to bend to the HOA's pressure. The consultant, a wiry, middle-aged engineer named Caldwell, arrived in a dusty pickup truck with tools piled haphazardly in the back, and though his casual appearance might have suggested indifference, the methodical way he began his inspection revealed a level of seriousness that Liam found both reassuring and unsettling. Together they moved through the barn inch by inch, measuring clearances, checking wiring, testing alarms and sprinklers, inspecting beams for rot or instability. Caldwell spoke little, occasionally jotting notes in a worn leather pad, and after several hours he closed it with a snap and looked at Liam with a calm certainty. "There's nothing wrong here," he said. "This barn's safer than half the municipal buildings I've been in. Whatever they're claiming is political, not structural." The words gave Liam a surge of vindication, yet Caldwell's expression dimmed as he added, almost as an afterthought, "You should be careful, though. I got a call last week warning me not to take certain jobs out this way. Didn't say your name, but the description was close." Someone doesn't want independent reports floating around. He shrugged as though used to such warnings, but the implication was clear. The HOA was not merely making noise, they were actively working to control the narrative. Liam paid Caldwell and thanked him, promising to keep his name out of anything unless it became absolutely necessary. Still, the seed of unease was planted. 2 nights later, Liam discovered the newspapers near the barn's side door, blackened at the edges and reeking faintly of smoke. Whoever had left them had either been clumsy or deliberate, as if the gesture was not an actual attempt to burn the barn but a staged warning, the theatrical placement of danger without the intention to finish the job. He stood staring at the mess for a long time, torn between rage and dread, because the act made clear that this fight was no longer confined to letters and fines. He cleaned it up in silence, tossing the charred remains into a metal bucket, and afterward sat in the barn's doorway for hours, the night wind carrying faint sounds of laughter from the distant clubhouse where lights still glowed in the windows. By the end of the week, Liam had resolved to gather evidence not only for his own defense but also to expose the hypocrisy of the HOA. He had heard whispers for years that the clubhouse itself was a patchwork of outdated systems, but like most rumors, it had always been difficult to separate truth from exaggeration. Now, driven by a mixture of desperation and anger, he decided to confirm it for himself. On a Thursday evening, when the clubhouse was locked after office hours and the parking lot empty, he let himself inside through a side door whose lock had been installed improperly and gave way with little resistance. The building was silent except for the low hum of a vending machine in the hall, and the smell of stale carpet and disinfectant clung to the air like mildew. He moved cautiously, every creak of the floorboards making his pulse quicken, until he reached a storage room in the basement where old files and equipment were kept. What he found there stunned him more than he had anticipated. Stacked against the wall were boxes of fire safety equipment still in their packaging, extinguishers, smoke detectors, and even a control panel for a modern sprinkler system, all purchased over a year ago according to the receipts attached. Yet none of it had ever been installed. Next to the boxes sat a crate of inspection forms with signatures conspicuously missing from the official slots, as though someone had prepared the documents but never filed them. Liam's fingers trembled as he flipped through the reports, realizing that the board had been aware of its own violations for years, but had chosen to ignore them, directing its energy instead toward policing the homes of residents who could not fight back. The irony was bitter. His barn was accused of being a hazard, while the very building in which the HOA conducted its business was a tinderbox. He considered taking some of the documents with him, but the risk of being caught in the act forced him to compromise. He copied down notes by hand, filling page after page in his notebook until his fingers cramped, recording dates, names, and references to budgets allocated for safety upgrades that had clearly been siphoned elsewhere. By the time he left the clubhouse, slipping out into the damp night air, his heart was racing not just from the adrenaline of trespassing, but from the knowledge that he was no longer dealing with mere negligence. The association was guilty of willful misconduct, and their fixation on his barn was not about safety but about deflection. If a real fire broke out, they would need a scapegoat, and he had been chosen. The following day brought another twist. As Liam sat on his porch reviewing his notes, Mrs. Ellis approached, her cane tapping softly against the walkway. She looked around nervously before leaning in close and whispering that years ago her late husband had served briefly on the HOA board, only to resign after clashing with Julian over financial irregularities. He said they were using safety funds for things that had nothing to do with safety, she murmured, her eyes darting toward the street as though afraid of being overheard. When he tried to speak up, they made life miserable for us. Fines, inspections, constant harassment. He couldn't take it. I think what they're doing to you is the same thing. Liam listened, a cold certainty settling into him, and thanked her quietly. He realized then that the conflict was no longer a private struggle. It was part of a larger pattern, a system of control sustained by intimidation and selective enforcement. That night, as rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled across the horizon, Liam sat in the barn with a lamp burning low, going over his notes again and again. The old timbers creaked around him, but instead of hearing fragility, he heard endurance, the persistence of wood and nails that had outlived generations of change. He thought of Caldwell's quiet warning, of Mrs. Ellis's whispered confession, of the unopened boxes in the clubhouse basement, and it all connected into a picture darker than he had wanted to admit. The barn was not just a building under attack. It was the shield he had been forced to raise against a machine that devoured those who resisted. Somewhere deep inside he felt the shift, the moment when survival turned into defiance. He would not only defend the barn, he would expose them, because now he had proof that the real fire hazard did not sit in his backyard, but in the very heart of the organization that claimed to protect them all. The storm outside intensified, sheets of rain pounding the roof like fists, and Liam closed his notebook with deliberate finality. He understood the danger of what he was stepping into, that men like Julian Cross did not yield quietly, and that his discovery would only provoke harsher retaliation. Yet he also understood that silence was no longer an option. As lightning flashed across the yard and illuminated the barn's silhouette against the dark sky, Liam felt an unfamiliar surge of clarity. For years he had lived in quiet grief, retreating into solitude as if that would protect him from the cruelty of the world. But the HOA had stripped away that illusion, forcing him into a fight he had never sought. Now he would fight not only because they threatened the barn, but because in doing so they threatened the memory of his father, the love of his wife, and the fragile piece of dignity he still carried. And for the first time since her death, he felt a flicker of purpose stronger than sorrow. The midpoint had arrived, and with it, the certainty that everything from this moment forward would be war. The retaliation did not come immediately, which in some ways made it worse, because the waiting stretched into a silence that felt deliberate, as though the association had stepped back not out of surrender, but to calculate its next move. And when it finally arrived, it carried the weight of something carefully designed to unsettle rather than to resolve. It began with a formal letter, longer than the first, drafted in colder and more legalistic language, announcing that since Mr. Harper had failed to demonstrate meaningful progress toward compliance, the HOA was initiating legal proceedings to enforce demolition of the barn, complete with an attached notice of a pending lien against his property should he resist. The letter cited municipal ordinances with a precision that was clearly intended not to persuade but to intimidate, and though Liam knew enough about codes to recognize how selectively they were being applied, the realization that the board had escalated to legal warfare pressed on him like a tightening vice. He might have been able to endure the letter alone, but the nights that followed carried darker reminders that the fight was no longer confined to paper. One evening, after returning late from a visit to the hardware store, Liam saw flickers of movement near the barn, shadows darting at the edges of the floodlight's reach. "Hicker!" he shouted, but whoever had been there slipped into the darkness before he could catch more than the outline of a figure in a hooded jacket. When he approached the barn's side, he found fresh scorch marks near the base of the wall, black streaks still warm to the touch, and the faint smell of accelerant clung to the soil. This was no longer performance. Someone had attempted to set the structure ablaze, and only incompetence or hesitation had prevented the fire from catching. His chest tightened with fury and fear in equal measure because he knew the attack was not random. No one outside the neighborhood cared enough to target him, and the timing, so soon after the lien notice, made the connection unavoidable. The next morning, before he had even finished his coffee, there was a knock at his door. Two men stood on the porch, not neighbors, but strangers, dressed in bland business attire with laminated badges hanging from lanyards that identified them as community compliance officers. Their tone was falsely cordial as they informed him they were there to conduct a follow-up inspection, citing the board's authority to enter and evaluate. Liam refused, telling them they had no warrant and that his property was private. But the exchange left him rattled. The badges had looked legitimate at first glance, yet the more he replayed the moment, the more convinced he became that the men were not municipal employees at all, but enforcers dispatched by Julian, part of a theater of intimidation meant to make him doubt his own footing. He called the city later that day and confirmed that no such inspection had been scheduled, and the representative on the phone grew uncomfortably quiet when he mentioned the name of his subdivision, as though she knew but dared not comment. The escalation spread in quieter ways, too, woven into the fabric of daily life. His bank informed him of a temporary hold on his account due to reported irregularities, which were resolved only after hours of phone calls, but the timing was suspicious. His trash pickup suddenly ceased without explanation while his neighbors continued as normal, forcing him to haul bags to a distant disposal site. A contractor he had contacted for potential renovations canceled abruptly, citing schedule conflicts, though Liam could hear the unease in his voice and suspected someone had warned him away. Each incident might have been dismissed in isolation, but together they painted a pattern of pressure, a slow grind meant to corner him until exhaustion did what threats could not. And yet Liam was not without resources. He had his notes from the clubhouse, his sketches of unopened boxes of fire equipment, his detailed copies of missing signatures and diverted budgets. He began compiling them into a file, organizing them with the same precision he once applied to architectural plans, building a structure of evidence brick by brick. He shared some of it discreetly with Caldwell, the engineer, who agreed to testify if necessary despite the earlier warning. He also spoke quietly with Mrs. Ellis, who, emboldened by his persistence, gave him a folder of her late husband's papers, yellowed documents that contained minutes from old HOA meetings where budget lines for safety improvements had been reassigned to general development, with no explanation. One sheet bore Julian's signature, dated nearly a decade earlier, approving a transfer of funds that had never been accounted for. Liam stared at the page for a long time, realizing he now had the proof of corruption that extended far beyond his barn. Still, knowledge did not shield him from danger. A week after the attempted arson, he returned home to find a crude symbol spray-painted on his driveway, a black X inside a circle, meaningless at first glance but menacing in its placement. Neighbors avoided his gaze when he asked if they had seen anything, their silence more revealing than words. That night he sat in the barn with a hammer in hand, listening for sounds in the dark, the creak of branches or the crunch of gravel on the path. He was tired, more tired than he could remember being, but beneath the fatigue was a core of resolve that the HOA had failed to extinguish. The escalation had reached a point where retreat would mean not only losing the barn, but losing the last fragments of dignity and independence he possessed. The next community meeting was called under the pretext of addressing financial updates, but Liam knew better. When he arrived, Julian greeted him with exaggerated warmth, introducing him to the room as though he were the subject of a friendly debate rather than a man under siege. Midway through the meeting, Julian unveiled a motion to accelerate demolition proceedings, claiming that Liam's continued non-compliance endangered the community. But Liam had come prepared. He rose, his voice steady despite the tremor of adrenaline, and laid out his findings in careful detail. The unopened fire equipment, the missing inspection signatures, the budget transfers, the pattern of negligence that implicated not only Julian, but the entire board. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room, and for the first time Julian's mask cracked, his voice rising in anger as he tried to dismiss the evidence as irrelevant. Yet the unease in the crowd told Liam that the balance had shifted, that the association's authority was no longer unassailable. The second escalation had reached its peak, and though he knew the battle was far from over, Liam felt something he had not felt in years. The weight of silence breaking, the beginning of cracks in the edifice of power that had loomed over him for so long. He returned home that night with the sense that the war had truly begun, and that the fire the HOA had tried to kindle against him might, in the end, consume them instead. The fire began not with a dramatic explosion or a sudden inferno, but with the subtle, almost invisible signs that only later would reveal themselves as the opening act of catastrophe. It was a Friday evening, humid and restless when the clubhouse lights glowed late into the night, a sure sign that Julian and his circle were still inside, likely plotting how to counter the evidence Liam had laid out at the last meeting. Liam, seated on his porch with his notes spread before him, saw the faintest flicker through the distant windows, an unusual pulse of orange that did not belong to lamplight. And for a moment he thought his tired eyes were betraying him. Then the flicker grew, shifting into a restless glow that began to bleed outward until the air itself seemed to pulse with heat. Within minutes, the glow sharpened into flames that licked hungrily at the curtains inside the second-floor windows, and then the fire burst outward with a roar that split the quiet night. Neighbors emerged into the street in clusters, some shouting, others frozen in shock, their disbelief a tangible weight in the air. Liam did not move at first, transfixed by the brutal irony of it all, watching the very building that had accused his barn of being a hazard now turn into a beacon of uncontrolled destruction. The fire spread with astonishing speed, racing along dry timber and through neglected wiring that sparked like serpents striking from the walls. Smoke rose in thick black plumes, carrying the bitter stench of burning carpet and varnish, and the sound of glass shattering punctuated the night like gunfire. Someone called for the fire department, but Liam knew even before the sirens began wailing in the distance that the structure was doomed. He stood among the crowd as chaos unfolded, listening to the fragmented voices around him, accusations, prayers, curses, as if the neighborhood had been thrust into a collective nightmare. He heard one man mutter that the sprinklers should have activated, another swear that alarms had not sounded, and a woman cry out that important documents were inside. Each comment struck Liam like an echo of the evidence he had uncovered: the unopened equipment, the unsigned inspections, the budgets that had vanished into Julian's pockets. It was not an accident that the fire had spread unchecked. It was the inevitable result of years of negligence disguised as authority. Julian himself appeared at last, stumbling out through the smoke-stained doors, his suit jacket discarded, his face red with fury and panic. He shouted orders to no one in particular, demanding that hoses be fetched, that people form lines, that someone take responsibility, but his words carried no weight anymore. The crowd had turned, their fear mutating into anger, their eyes narrowing as the truth crystallized before them. Liam caught Julian's gaze across the shifting light of the flames, and for the first time the man who had always exuded calm superiority looked diminished, a figure stripped of his armor, exposed by the very disaster he had claimed to prevent. The fire engines arrived, their lights spinning red against the night, and firefighters rushed into action, but the building was already a lost cause. They focused on containing the blaze, preventing it from spreading to nearby homes, while the clubhouse itself collapsed inward with a sickening groan, sparks and embers scattering into the dark like a storm of fireflies. Liam felt the heat against his skin even from a distance, and the roar of the flames drowned out the murmurs of the crowd until all that remained was the terrible music of destruction. In that moment, standing with the neighbors who had once avoided him, Liam felt no triumph, only the grim weight of inevitability. He had warned them. He had shown them the evidence. He had endured threats and harassment, and still they had turned a blind eye until the truth announced itself in fire. Yet, amid the smoke and ruin, he also sensed a shift, a collective recognition that the narrative had changed. His barn no longer stood as a symbol of danger. It stood as a survivor, unscathed while the edifice of the HOA's power crumbled to ash. When the fire was finally reduced to smoldering embers and the firefighters began their weary cleanup, neighbors turned to Liam not with suspicion but with questions, with apologies, with tentative gestures of respect. Julian tried to rally one last defense, claiming that the fire was sabotage, that outsiders must have set it deliberately, but the words fell flat against the evidence of neglect and the testimonies that now bubbled to the surface. Residents recalling broken alarms, faulty wiring, and repeated delays in promised repairs. The board had lost its hold, and Julian, his face ashen beneath the soot, looked suddenly like a man standing alone on a battlefield he no longer controlled. For Liam, the climax was not in the fire itself, but in the silence that followed. A silence heavy with recognition that the truth could no longer be denied. The barn remained standing, untouched by flame, while the clubhouse, the very heart of the association's authority, lay in ruins. The irony was too sharp to ignore, and for the first time, the balance of power shifted irreversibly, not through speeches or documents, but through the undeniable, searing reality of fire. In the weeks after the fire, the neighborhood was marked by a strange quiet, as if the flames that had consumed the clubhouse had burned away not only wood and carpet, but also the illusion of control that the HOA had held over every household. The ruins still stood behind a chain-link fence, blackened beams jutting upward like the bones of a carcass, a constant reminder of what had happened and what had been ignored for too long. Insurance adjusters and city officials came and went, their clipboards filling with notes, and whispers about investigations circulated in the air like smoke that refused to dissipate. For once, Liam did not feel the weight of suspicion pressing down on him. The eyes of his neighbors, once averted, now sought him out with cautious respect, as though they had finally recognized not just his defiance but the truth behind it. Julian resigned before the month was out, his final act delivered in a letter distributed to every mailbox, written in the same inflated tone he had always used, insisting that his departure was voluntary and that he was stepping aside for the good of the community. Few believed him. Rumors spread of missing funds, of legal inquiries, of subpoenas that would keep him busy for years to come. Without him, the board fractured, members scrambling to distance themselves, to claim ignorance, to plead that they had only followed procedure. Yet the community no longer listened with the same obedience. Residents began meeting informally in living rooms and backyards, talking not about lawns or mailboxes, but about how to rebuild trust and establish rules that served people rather than controlled them. As for Liam, he returned to the rhythm of his days with a steadiness he had not felt in years. The barn stood untouched, its walls carrying the faint scent of smoke blown from the clubhouse but otherwise unharmed, a survivor not only of time but of the war waged against it. Sometimes, when he sat inside with his sketches spread across the workbench, he thought of his father and his wife, of the quiet perseverance they had embodied, and he felt a strange peace in knowing that he had protected this fragment of their legacy. He did not revel in victory, for victory seemed too shallow a word for what had been lost and what had been endured. But he felt something deeper, a restoration of dignity, a recognition that he had refused to bend even when bending would have been easier. And in the faces of neighbors who now stopped by to offer greetings, to ask for advice, to share small tokens of reconciliation, he sensed that the fire had changed more than just the balance of power. It had reminded them all that authority without responsibility was nothing more than tinder waiting for a spark,